Hello, everybody. It's your third favorite balding, red-bearded person. Don't know who your first and second favorite are, but there's probably somebody in your life or two somebodies in your life that you like more than me. Anyway, it's me, Keith, of ROTC, and doing the second of what we've decided to dub as the Overtime podcast, in which we do these quick sort of deep dives into a specific category or talking subject that we find interesting. Today I want to talk a little bit about upcoming Florida sophomore quarterback Feleipe Franks, and specifically how he can avoid becoming the next in a long line of troubled or underperforming or I guess you would call quarterback busts. And why I actually think that that's a little bit of a smokescreen, and we'll get into that later. So let's jump right in. When you think about the University of Florida and their quarterbacks, a lot of really good names come to mind. Specifically, the legend himself, Steve Spurrier. And then you get into the 90s, and you've got Heisman Trophy winner Danny Warfel. Whether or not you like him, Jesse Palmer was a fairly successful quarterback at the University of Florida. And then you had Rex Grossman, who threw for 1 million yards. And then you come to the next two quarterbacks who were very important in the history of Florida, Chris Leak and Tim Tebow. Chris Leak, not your prototypical quarterback, but came into the Urban Meyer system as more of a pro-style quarterback, even though he's like 5'5". Leads the team to their second ever national championship in 2006, aided by, of course, soon-to-be Florida football Jesus, Tim Tebow. Eventually, Chris Leak does give way to Tim Tebow, and we all know what kind of a college quarterback Tim Tebow was. One of the best college football players ever to play the game. Leads Florida to their third national championship in 2008, wins the Heisman Trophy in 2007. Lots and lots of accolades, sets all kinds of Florida Gator football records. And then he eventually rides off into the NFL sunset. The sunset might have happened a little early for him, but that's a different conversation. So following Tim Tebow, you have this weird kind of void in Florida quarterbacks that live up to, I guess, the standard of what Florida fans consider to be successful. Immediately following Tim Tebow, in Urban Meyer's last full season as Florida coach, you have John Brantley. Now, John Brantley was a high school quarterback in the state of Florida, and Tim Tebow set tons of records in Florida high school football. Guess who broke a bunch of them? Your boy, John Brantley. So John Brantley comes into the Urban Meyer system, not exactly your typical spread offense quarterback, but if he broke a bunch of Tim Tebow's records, he's probably pretty good. Well, that ended up not being the case. He didn't have the benefit of having Dan Mullen to help him develop, to bring him along in that system. Instead, you have Steve Adazio, who was not very good at what he did, in my opinion. Florida's offense in 2009 had a lot of the same powerhouse players on offense that they did in their previous 2 years, in which they scored bunches of points and won a national championship. Florida eked out a bunch of wins, close games against opponents that probably shouldn't have been nearly as close as they were. And John Brantley just did not have a good time as Florida starter. In his first full year as the heir apparent to Tim Tebow, plays in all 13 games, only throws for a hair over 2,000 yards, only 9 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. Not a successful year. Urban Meyer fakes his death and leaves the University of Florida. Will Muschamp comes in, takes over, brings in a more pro-style offense that is suited way more to the skill set of John Brantley. But things still don't go well. Plays in 11 games, throws for, again, a hair over 2,000 yards, 11 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. Again, nothing to write home about. Look, it was always going to be really tough for whoever came in behind Tim Tebow to not live in his shadow. Regardless of what he did, it just wasn't going to be enough. It didn't help that John Brantley was incredibly middling throughout his 2 years as the Florida starter. But, these things happen. Moving on, you have Jeff Driscoll that comes in, and you're going to see sort of a trend here in Florida quarterback recruitments. Jeff Driscoll was one of the highest recruited quarterbacks coming out of high school. He signs with Florida. As a freshman, he backs up John Brantley, so doesn't get a whole lot of playing time. 2012 is his year. He comes in, plays in all 12 games, throws for about 1,600 yards, 12 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Decent for a sophomore coming in. But it was his demeanor with the ball. It was how he played the game. Was very reminiscent of Tim Tebow. Worked well in a read option offense. The next year, a lot of hype coming in. He breaks his leg during the Tennessee game. He's out the rest of the year. And moving forward from that, he never really reestablishes himself as the guy. Whether it was confidence issues, the offense under Muschamp was a mess. We talked about it in this week's podcast. He had 3 OCs in 3 years with him. And honestly, Driscoll was kind of the scapegoat for Florida's offensive woes. Deserve it or not, I don't think he did deserve everything that he got, but he was the one that had the blame placed on him for a lot of what happened. So Muschamp is fired or resigns. I can't remember what happened. Anyway, he's out of there, and instead of sticking around, Driscoll transfers to Louisiana Tech. And this is where another part of this trend continues to kind of show itself. In his year at Louisiana Tech, he played in all 13 games, threw for 4,026 yards, 27 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions, while also picking up 323 yards rushing. So I get that the competition is probably going to be a little bit less cumbersome than what he faced while at Florida, but those are really good numbers. And so it kind of makes you think, was he actually the problem, or was there something else going on? Jacoby Brissett, while was never the starter at Florida, he battled Jeff Driscoll for the starting job in their sophomore years. Once it became obvious that Brissett was not going to be the starter, he wasn't going to play at Florida, he transfers to North Carolina State. Is incredibly consistent, plays in all the games his final 2 years of college, throws for a combined 5,200 yards and a combined 43 touchdowns to 11 interceptions. Pretty impressive stuff. After Driscoll leaves, you have this weird platooning of Tyler Murphy and Skylar Morningway, which I'm not even sure that's a real person, and Trayon Harris. None of them are very good. Nothing significant happens. Will Grier comes to the team. Again, another very highly regarded prospect coming out of high school. Signs with Florida. In 2015, he gets his chance to start, winning the job from Trayon Harris. In 6 games, throws for 1,200 yards. 2 of those games, he split time with Trayon Harris as new coach Jim McElwain tries to figure out who he wants to be starting quarterback. I think that we're all aware of what happened with Will Grier and his issues with the NCAA. He ends up getting suspended for a year because of PED use. Eventually just leaves the school, transfers to West Virginia, sits out the 2016 season, comes back in 2017, throws for 3,500 yards with 35 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. So you can see that there is a pretty significant trend here in which highly regarded, highly scouted, highly recruited quarterbacks come into Florida and just aren't able to shoulder the load. They transfer to a different school and they have these massively breakout seasons. And you're just kind of wondering, like, are these quarterbacks that are coming to Florida really busts? Are they terrible quarterbacks? Well, the stats would say otherwise. They're not terrible quarterbacks. They're actually really good. And when they're put into a system and given some confidence boost by the coaching staff and put into positions to where they can succeed, they are extremely successful. So that brings us now to Feleipe Franks, another highly recruited quarterback coming out of high school. In high school, he threw for a combined 7,300 yards in 3 seasons to 87 touchdowns and only 17 interceptions over his career. He's a big dude. Chandler mentioned it in this previous podcast. He's 6'5", 230 pounds. He is the definition of a pro set offense quarterback, which you would think would be great under McElwain because that's what he ran. But with Mullen coming in, that raises some questions about maybe how he's going to do. But before we get into sort of how Feleipe Franks fits into Dan Mullen's offense, take a quick look at how he did last year. True freshman coming in, the heir apparent to Luke Del Rio, who did an okay job kind of bridging the gap between Will Grier and this sort of new era that we're stepping into. He played in the first several games, split some time in the opening game against Michigan. Again, seems to be kind of a trend here as McElwain tries to figure out who he wants to be starting quarterback. He splits time with Luke Del Rio. Luke Del Rio ends up getting hurt in the Tennessee game, and Feleipe Franks is forced into the starting role again. Does good in the win against Tennessee, 212 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. Very serviceable for a true freshman quarterback who is, kind of thrust into a weird situation. The rest of the year didn't really go as he planned it, as anybody planned it. But there was the weird situation with McElwain, and he had clearly given up on the season, maybe even before it really started. And I don't think that Feleipe Franks can be blamed for what happened to his team last year and to him. Sure, he made some bad decisions, but they were also trying to do some things with him that he probably shouldn't have been doing. The play calling was very confusing. He did not look ready, and that's on the coaches. You're throwing a true freshman in there who you've basically told you won't play very much because Luke Del Rio has the spot. So McElwain is fired after the Georgia game, and then the interim coach doesn't have a whole lot of faith in him, so they play Notre Dame transfer Malik Zaire, and he does terribly. So they let Franks finish out the year, and he does, just okay. With a loss against South Carolina, a close loss, win against UAB, and a loss against Florida State. So here we are. Dan Mullen comes in, runs a fairly different offense than what Feleipe Franks is kind of built for. So the overall question to what we're talking about here today is how can Feleipe Franks avoid becoming the next quarterback at Florida who is seen as a bust? I've argued that while maybe the quarterbacks while at Florida were seen as a bust, it's very clear that it wasn't the quarterbacks that are actually busts at the college level. They went on to have excellent careers at other universities. So what's the deal? Obviously, with Muschamp, there were some issues with the offense. He never got established what he wanted to establish. There was a lot of turnover in the coaching staff, and he never really got done what he wanted to get done. Same thing with McElwain, which is really curious about McElwain because his nickname was the quarterback whisperer. So you would have thought that, Florida had guys like Will Grier coming in. Granted, we'll never get to see how Will Grier would have done at Florida because of the NCAA stepping in and suspending him for the use of PEDs, which I could go on about that forever. It was a really weird situation, and it's unfortunate that he felt like he had to leave. But after that, Florida had to rely on Trayon Harris for large chunks of that season, the prior year, and until Luke Del Rio showed up. And, Luke Del Rio always, to me, felt like more of a backup who was playing a starter's role. He was fine. He was serviceable. He could manage the offense well enough. But he was never going to be like the next Florida superstar. So here we have Feleipe Franks, who hopefully gets a fresh start under Dan Mullen. Again, it's not the offense that I think he's built for, but Feleipe Franks, there's a reason why he was one of the top quarterback recruits coming out of high school. He's got the physical tools to be successful. He has a very high ceiling. In terms of his abilities and in terms of his potential. Can he become the quarterback that leads Florida into, I guess you could call it like a new dawn, coming out of the darkness that was the McElwain and the Muschamp years? I don't know. He's a sophomore. Does he have the tools for it? Absolutely. And, Roe mentioned on last week's podcast again that when Dan Mullen got to state, he didn't have his quarterback. He had Tyson Lee and Russell at state. Not guys built for his system, but he tailored the offense to make them successful. And I fully expect him to do that at Florida. Meyer is a really good player developer. He can be a little intense and hard to work for, hard to play for. But it says something that when every quarterback that he's gotten a hold of has been as successful as they have, you can't help but to feel really optimistic about the chances that Feleipe Franks will not only be serviceable, but will be very, very good at what he does at Florida. Heisman candidate? Probably not. Is he capable of leading the Florida offense to at least be consistently effective? My answer to that would be yes. So we will see in just a few short weeks as he debuts. The job is his to lose. We'll see how he does. That's going to be it for me here at the ROTC studios. Give us a follow on iTunes. Give us a follow on Google Play. Give us a follow on Spotify. I will catch you guys later.